Wow, this has been an incredible experience for all of us. The PsyTech team has put on an amazing event, and I will like to now introduce someone. And I said it's always a pleasure to introduce someone who needs no introduction, but I do have the exceptional honor of introducing one of the psychedelic community's leading advocates, an ambassador, a researcher, and an educator. In 2008, Professor Johnson published the still current guidelines for safety for psychedelic research that helped resurrect psychedelic research in humans. He's supervised over 600 psychedelic sessions and personally guided over 100 of them. Professor Johnson has published studies on nearly all psychoactive drug classes, including cocaine, methamphetamine, tobacco, alcohol, caffeine, Savril A, and of course psilocybin. I'm still pondering the question you asked at Insight last year from Stephen Wright. If God took LSD, would he see people? I'll leave you all with that. Please welcome Professor Matthew Johnson to tell us more about the work being done at the Center for Psychedelic Research. Professor Matthew Johnson.
It's a pleasure to do this. You know, long way here. Deb tried to rope me into something this originally when it was going to be live in Israel a long time ago, and there was back and forth and scheduled conflicts, and somehow everything worked out thanks, I guess, to a pandemic. But hope everyone seriously is doing as well as possible during this time, and it's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm going to be overviewing some psychedelic work that we've done at Hopkins. I'm right here in my COVID bunker, which is my basement. I have to tell you, I've broken out like really my best threads for this. I'm wearing, the blazer here, but I'll tell you a secret. I'm wearing athletic shorts. So in the pandemic era, I think this is this is basically my highest level of formal attire here. So I'll proceed. So before I move forward, I'll tell you that in terms of conflicts of interest, I advise a number of groups that are doing work relevant here. So I just want to kind of get that out there. I'm showing you those on the screen. And Ronnie kind of gave you one of the jokes I sometimes like to give people to, during a talk, because a lot of times we take ourselves too seriously during psychedelic research, because we're really onto something. Like, this stuff can help people, and it's like, please take me seriously. But a little joke, we can take ourselves too seriously. So one more for you, recent one I came up with. So why did the tourist in Amsterdam purchase sclerotia rather than mushrooms? You have to be a real aficionado to get this one. Why did the tourist in Amsterdam purchase sclerotia rather than mushrooms? Because he didn't want to get in truffle. See, like the truffles are allowed and the mushrooms aren't. Anyway, okay. I said one more, but okay, I lied. There's one visual one, and you just got to let this sink in. So there should be an initial laugh, because it's like the count, and the count's always funny. Blah, 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 blah. And then, of course, you notice the 8 turning into an infinity. So, all right. They did not rope me into this for my comedy skills. I am moving on. I'll tell you a little about this psychedelic center. So we've been conducting research for almost a couple of decades now at Hopkins on psychedelics, and I've been there for 16 years, since 2004. We've only recently started calling ourselves a center, because that's sort of academic language for having a certain level of substantial funding and infrastructure for research. And so thanks to the Cohen Foundation and the Tim Fair's collaborative, last fall, we actually got to that center level, and that's going to come with a large, it's huge investment in the work that we're doing. It's going to come with a number of new studies. I'm not going to step through all of these. I'm showing you on the screen. I'm the principal investigator of some work looking to see if psilocybin can help people with opioid addiction. And also another study that I'm PI on is research looking to see if we can help people with PTSD using psilocybin. A number of other great threads to explore there, as I'm showing you on the screen. Very thankful for the funders to really expand this work. We've been we've been living by a wing and a prayer for, a couple of decades now. So now we can finally really have the resources that we need to kick into high gear. So of course, the backdrop to all of this is that, we had these, the dark ages following this initial very promising era of research during the 1950s, mid 50s through early 70s, a few therapeutic threads that looked promising, a lot of fascinating emerging basic biological and neuroscientific understanding. But then everything went on a deep freeze. And this was despite those promising preliminary results. And this dormancy for a few decades was really, it was never because it was ever shown that research could not be done safely. It was really a reaction to the casualties that were real. There were some definitely real casualties with the reckless use of these compounds, particularly amongst the vulnerable. Keep in mind, the average dose of acid on the street was 300 micrograms in those days, and it's about 50 micrograms these days. So the bad trips were a real thing. You talk to clinicians from those era, and they'll have some stories for you, and they're not to be underestimated. But also, it's even bigger than that. Is the dormancy was due to just the association with the worldwide counterculture movement of the late 1960s. And unfortunately, even the most cautious researchers, ones like Humphrey Osmond and Sidney Cohen and Abram Hoffer, who were begging folks like Leary to, tone it down, and were always very careful to acknowledge the risks and the caution necessary. Unfortunately, those voices weren't heard. And it was a few decades before we could pick up again. And so here I'm showing you the pickup. I'm plotting PubMed Hits. That's kind of where you look up scientific articles, one of the places. And you can see, these are hits for the term psychedelic or hallucinogen. And showing you going back to 1980, you really had stable, very little scientific interest, 10, maybe 20 papers a year. And then you kind of hit the late 90s, early 2000, and there's this little inkling in an upward trend. And I started my postdoc and initiated my involvement in psychedelic research in 2004, around the time when things started to really shoot upward a little more. And so I've been fortunate to be working with great colleagues and see a growing number of wonderful colleagues, both at Hopkins and at a number of institutions worldwide, jump into this area and realize that there really is something here. And we're clearly seeing exponential growth here. And I can't wait to fill in that data point for, there's still hits trickling into the system for 2019, but filling in 2019 and 20, I bet we're going to see a continuation of that trend. I don't have time to step through all of the risks in this area, but please believe me that there are substantial risks to any powerful tool. And so we know a lot about what those are with psychedelics. People know the bad trip. Most people know that if you're vulnerable to schizophrenia type illnesses, probably not a good idea to be taking these substances. Importantly, there is a way to squarely mitigate these risks in the conduct of careful research, and in the future, if data hold up, in conducting FDA and other regulatory body approved research with these compounds. We envision strong regulatory guidelines that would put in place recommendations for keeping people safe, and a template for that may not turn out to be exactly this, but as Ronnie mentioned, one of my earliest efforts in the field was to review the exhaustive older area and review the risks and suggest what safety measures should be put in place. And I will refer you to that 2018 paper that I had in the last slide, where looking at the abuse potential and the risks, I and my colleagues land at the notion that if psilocybin were approved as a medication, probably the best placement for it would be in Schedule 4 in the current Controlled Substances Act framework in the United States. It's currently in Schedule 1. So part of keeping people safe is the interpersonal and the physical environment. So here's just an example of a mock participant lying on a couch wearing eye shades and headphones, and their hand being held through a hypothetical challenging experience. I'll tell you about some of the early work we did with psilocybin at Hopkins in healthy normals, academic lingo for people without a nominal problem to fix. But, believe me, as you probably know, everyone has problems to fix, whether they're diagnosable or not. So conducted some studies in healthy normals. And the biggest thing that shook out from these initial studies was that, it was safe, and that people reported remarkable improvements in mood and quality of life over a year after sessions. And it wasn't just them. It was community observers, in other words, spouses, coworkers, friends that volunteered to provide responses about the participant in the study that said, this person seems different. So here's another result from early psychedelic work, where we did a careful dose effect study where we had true placebo plus 4 different active doses of psilocybin. And we found that increasing the psilocybin dose had a very orderly effect on the likelihood of a mystical experience. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And on challenging experiences. We call them that in this context. It's what people call bad trips. And also the long-term attribution of benefit. So clearly, there's more than pharmacology going on here, but when you look at data like this under double-blind conditions, you see this beautiful graded dose-effect relationship. You certainly know that pharmacology is playing a critical role. I mentioned mystical experience. 60% of people in those first 2 healthy normal studies met a priori criteria for a so-called full mystical experience. And this is a construct. It sounds woo-woo, but it's not. It's a psychological construct that goes back to William James. There are good psychometric scales to validate it. We've actually developed the only one specifically designed to measure an event like a psychedelic experience rather than just surveying a lifetime. But James was fascinated. What it is James and others were fascinated by this idea that these extraordinary human experiences have remarkable similarity. I'm talking about largely from non-drug experiences. People from different parts of the world, across different centuries, people speaking different languages, people affiliated with different religions, even though oftentimes, but not always, these experiences are interpreted in a religious framework. There's these remarkable similarities. And some of those similarities are an overwhelming sense of unity, overriding positivity, positive mood, a sense of transcending the bounds of time and space. And then an ineffability, the idea that this experience is fundamentally beyond words. So humans have been reporting experiences like that, not just with drugs, but without, for a long time. And you increase the probability of an experience like that dramatically when you give a substance like psilocybin or other classic psychedelics. And some research has found that those experiences aren't uncommon in the population, even outside of drugs, but they may happen once or twice in someone's lifetime. With psilocybin, you can schedule a session next Tuesday, and there's a pretty decent likelihood someone's going to not a guarantee, but really good shot someone's going to have an experience like that. So it's a wonderful experimental tool to examine that type of phenomena. So across those healthy normal studies, our first 2 studies, we combined the data and found something interesting. This is the first study ever to show that a discrete laboratory experience actually changed a personality dimension. The definition of personality is that it's supposed to be stable. You might see, changes that, over decades of the lifespan or with major life events, but certainly nothing that you can experimentally manipulate until this finding. So we found an increase in the personality construct of openness. What is openness? Well, it's tolerance for other people's points of views, the ability to hold seemingly mutually exclusive ideas at the same time, sort of thinking in a both and rather than an either or framework, and an appreciation for aesthetics, beauty. So this was increased, and with psilocybin, and I'm showing you here, it wasn't just getting psilocybin. If you got a big dose of psilocybin and you didn't have that type of mystical experience, we didn't see a change in openness. But if you had the full mystical experience under psilocybin, those people drove the effect. And it was a powerful effect because it was powerful enough in people with the mystical experience that the effect was significant, even if you combined all the participants. So getting now into some of our therapeutic work, this is our cancer study. This is the largest study that's been conducted with psilocybin and in cancer patients alleviating depression and anxiety. There have been 3 to this point randomized studies. This was 51 patients. They all had life-threatening cancer. About a third had a depressive disorder, about a third anxiety, and about a third had a combination of both depression and anxiety. Here's the design, really the nuts and bolts. The important thing is everyone got 2 doses, a trivial dose really meant to serve as an active placebo, and a high dose, a substantial dose that we thought might be effective. And what we randomized was just the order. You either got the trivial dose first and the larger dose later, or vice versa, the large dose first, trivial dose later. Everyone is screened at the beginning, and then they were randomized to those 2 groups. After careful preparation, they have either the high dose or the trivial dose session. 5 weeks later, we assess outcomes. Then they're crossed over, meaning now you get whatever condition you didn't get last time. So the trivial folks now get the high dose and vice versa. 5 weeks later, we assess symptoms of these people. And then 6 months later, long-term follow-up. So here are the data using the Hamilton Depression and Hamilton Anxiety inventories. These are gold standard inventories for these clinical symptoms. At the screening, which is labeled baseline on both panels, you see both the red and the blue groups, the high dose and the low dose groups, come in at clinically severe levels. You have to trust me on that. These are very high levels, indicating there's a real problem. Post 1 indicates 5 weeks after the first psilocybin session, whichever that was. You see for the red group, the folks that got the high dose, a dramatic reduction, and these are into non-clinical levels. You know, if you're not having any problems, you're going to have scores like this, you know, like everyday folks. Also a substantial reduction in the low dose group, probably a result of what we classically call the placebo effect, but also the very real rapport building, very deep connections built with the guides who are going to be with them during the session. So, but nonetheless, nowhere near as large of a reduction as the high dose group, and statistically different from the high dose group. Then post 2 shows 5 weeks after the crossover session. Now everyone has had the high dose psilocybin session, whether it was 5 or 10 weeks ago. And you can see now everyone is down to those very low symptom levels. And then that's astonishing enough at 5 weeks after or 10 weeks after an experience, but 6 months later, people are at the same levels. You know, this is really unprecedented. Ketamine's been considered a breakthrough for having antidepressant effects that last, on average now, the data is suggesting about a week. And that's legitimately considered a breakthrough, and we really needed a breakthrough like that. But here, these sessions are, you know, the antidepressant effects are at play 6 months later, which is just astonishing. And you see the same exact pattern essentially play out for the anxiety on the right panel. And I told you about the mystical experience. Well, quite interesting. The amount that depression and anxiety are reduced long-term is statistically related to how strong the mystical experience was in the session. And it's not how strong the psychedelic just drug strength was, the intensity. We measure that too, and that doesn't cut it. It's above and beyond that. It's the nature of the experience, what you went through, not just how strong it was, that had some relationship to these long-term outcomes. And by the way, I think we should, you know, we're in our infancy. We have much. I'm sure the mystical experience, there's more fundamental constructs that lie underneath that, both biologically and psychologically. We have a lot to figure out, but the fact that any sort of like measure of the experience during the session is predictive of these long-term effects above and beyond the strength of the drug is remarkable, and tells us that there is something about the experience. This is a psychological intervention. It's just not hitting neurons and treating symptoms. That's the key here. So I mentioned consistent findings, randomized studies. There was a small study about half the dose by my great colleague Charlie Grobe in this area back in 2011. Then our colleagues at NYU published a randomized study with 29 people, published at the same time as ours. same effect. I mean, particularly in the large dose study by the NYU group, very large effect size, dramatic decreases, and they had different methods than us. So with different, it speaks to the robustness of these effects. You can look at it different ways, and they are large effects. And then outside of cancer, our good colleague Robin Carhart Harris at Imperial College has published very promising pilot, open label pilot results for depression treatment. And I'll tell you that our group at Hopkins has recently completed a randomized study with depression, and so depression outside of cancer, just like Robin's study. And we indeed found large effects, much like those that Robin saw. And hopefully you'll be able to see those in the peer-reviewed literature soon. So now I'll move on to the other therapeutic application. I'll focus on smoking cessation. So I developed this approach as the principal investigator of this work. I mean, I'm a behaviorist at heart, and I'm fascinated by these experiences and what people say about them. But ultimately, I want to see behavior change. If you don't see behavior change, you need to step back and wonder what you're doing. And so I can think of no better way to test behavior change than treating addiction. And a really great way is to look at cigarette smoking. It's quantifiable. It's one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult addiction to treat. So, given some early data with both alcoholism and a little bit with heroin addiction, suggesting LSD could help, we went ahead and tested psilocybin treatment for smoking cessation. And of course, aside being a good model system of addiction, like tobacco is kind of a problem in and of itself. Here, I'm just showing you the number of deaths. This is in the United States of all the drugs. Tobacco, about 4 times the deaths per year than alcohol. And then, all of the illicit drugs combined barely show up on the same screen visually when you compare it to tobacco. So almost 500,000 people in the US a year. And that expands to about 5 million deaths worldwide. Huge opportunity. And even the most effective medications fail for the large majority of people long term. And 2/3 of smokers in the US and a lot of other areas actually want to quit. So this is just a major opportunity for behavior change that could help empower people to do what they want to do and haven't been able to make it happen. And so I think it's a great opportunity. We're always appreciative of when the press covers our research and other research in the psychedelic area. You can't always control what the headlines are or what the photos they use are. I'll just say, hopefully you've gotten the point by now that there are risks. I'm not encouraging anyone to use psychedelics on their own. There are risks. I think this is best done in context like I've described. However, I want to say with particular emphasis, holy cow, don't eat this many mushrooms. Like, seriously, on that one. That's a lot of mushrooms. Demographics for the people in this study. Important thing here was there were 15 people smoked about a pack a day and been smoking on average over 30 years. So these weren't lightweights. Multiple quit attempts, all of them for everybody. We combined it with a 15-week protocol of weekly meetings that largely use cognitive behavioral therapy. This is the main method that is used psychologically to help people quit smoking. Things like assigning a target quit date ahead of time, kind of going through what they like about smoking, what they don't like, what's in their long-term interest, how to deal if they slip, and how not to let that turn into a full-on relapse, things like that. Everyone had 3 psilocybin sessions starting over 8 weeks, starting at a moderate dose and then moving up to a higher dose, had the ability to adjust that if they had a very strong effect at the moderate dose. The first psilocybin session was on the target quit date. Here are the results from our, I'm showing you here, carbon monoxide. You breathe through a little machine just like an alcohol breathalyzer, and it tells you whether you've been smoking because smoking produces carbon monoxide in your system. And so study visits across the x-axis at the bottom and the dotted line going across horizontally is kind of the threshold telling you whether they've probably been smoking versus not. These are the data before psilocybin. These are the data after psilocybin. You don't have to be a stats whiz to tell you have a pre-post difference there. In terms of point prevalence abstinence, whether people are currently abstinent at all these different points in time. On average, 6 months after the treatment, 80% of participants were biologically confirmed as smoke-free. That held up at an average of 2.5 years to 60%. This was not a randomized trial. It was small, so results may not hold up. But I have to say, I'm not, nor others that are in the smoking field have ever run a study of this size where they find these success rates that are so high. Can't determine, causality because of it's not a randomized study. The real question was, is this worthy of follow-up? And so the answer to that question was abso-freaking-lutely. These were big effects. A lot of people quit smoking and they stayed quit. And again, you'll recognize a theme. They had greater success, both in terms of abstinence and in terms of craving reduction, in those who had the full mystical experience. So now we're on to the randomized comparative efficacy trial. With those data, we were able to dig up some money for a larger study. So this is in 80 people, 80 treatment-resistant smokers. They're randomized either psilocybin or nicotine patch treatment using FDA label guidelines, the standard way to use nicotine patch. The same cognitive behavioral therapy for both groups. More for experimental reasons, because we're doing fMRI before and after these sessions and long-term to try to figure out some mechanisms that are at play. But for experimental reasons, we scaled back from 3 to 1 psilocybin session. So just one high-dose 30 milligram body weight adjusted session. And these are our current data. Obviously, we're not running right now because of the COVID shutdown, but we're still doing follow-ups remotely with people and even doing remotely biological confirmation of abstinence or smoking. But these are our current data. At 12 months, the 44 people, and it's evenly split about between the two groups, the 44 people who have gotten to a year after their quit date, 59% are still smoke-free compared to 27% with nicotine patch. NRT means nicotine replacement therapy, same thing as patch. 27% is above what you typically get. It's in the range, but it's at the very high end of the range you get with nicotine patch. So I think it tells us we're doing a very credible job with nicotine patch, which I'm very proud of, because I'm trying to help all of these people quit. And Al Garcia in our group is the primary guy, and he's doing an exceptional job here. But nonetheless, over twice the efficacy long term. And so this could change. The study is in progress, but right now we're still very encouraged. We published a qualitative analysis thanks to our friend Tassin Noorani. What the people said long after, on average 2.5 years after their experience, said things that helped them from the session to help them quit. They said it gave them a sense of interconnectedness, awe, and curiosity that helped. It reduced their smoking withdrawal symptoms compared to other times when they attempted quitting. They said they had increases in altruism, appreciation for aesthetics. They said they gained insight into their self-identity and the idiosyncratic reasons of why they smoked as a person, very individualized. And they said the psilocybin gave them insights into this sort of story and allowed them to kind of shift their narrative surrounding smoking. We've also, I'll just tell you very briefly, published 3 studies that I've led as principal investigator, surveying people. I was presenting early data on this lab research, and people kept coming up afterwards and they'd say, man, this happened to me. I quit smoking. Sometimes they'd say 30 years ago, or I quit drinking because of this. And so I thought, wow, there's something here. And so I've with my colleagues, conducted a number of surveys where we collected these stories, and we published research with quitting tobacco, quitting and reducing tobacco, quitting and reducing alcohol, and then also our most recent work, quitting and reducing opioids, cocaine, methamphetamine, and cannabis, all from people with these stories. And typically it's the same across all these substances. Typically the person takes it, the psychedelic for fun or for exploration, but typically they're not trying to target quitting this other substance. And they have this experience, and they have this they frame it different ways, but this aha experience, like, what the hell am I doing? Like, I know what I need to do. I'm done. And sometimes it's a reduction. Sometimes it doesn't always stick. It's amazing that it ever happens without all of the preparation and the guidance and the follow-up care that we provide. So I think it's amazing that it appears to be happening even just when someone sometimes takes some acid or shrooms at a party and sees this dramatic behavior shift. And so we didn't require it, but one participant sent in a selfie of the last cigarette they ever smoked after eating. This is apparently a 1/4 ounce of mushrooms, a very high dose. This cat, we didn't require this cat to send on, the selfies, but they said, no, please use my image. It's a very, I'll just go ahead and show you. So this is the cat that, apparently you can see the pupils dilated huge. So it's not exactly biological verification, but I tend to believe that there really was a 1/4 ounce of mushrooms involved. And I promise, I think that's all of the jokes for those of you suffering. So big picture across these different things we're studying. Why in the world would psilocybin help with these different things? I mean, not just addiction. I haven't showed you data. I typically, with the longer talk, show you data from my colleague Mike Bogenschutz at NYU, who is finding success, just like the older LSD work, in using psilocybin to help people quit alcohol use disorder, alcoholism. So why would it be helping not only addiction? It's weird enough in addiction psychiatry for one medication to help across different forms of addiction, but then it's even stranger for them to say, okay, it looks like it's also effective for depression. And we're seeing depression, within cancer and outside of cancer, and both anxiety and depression within cancer. And I mentioned the, some of the other things we and others will be looking at, and, we'll see what holds up, but people need to you should be skeptical of snake oil. Like, okay, how could this work for everything? And it may not. It may be some of the things we study, we find out, oh, it doesn't work for anorexia. We just have to follow the data, to be clear. But given what we've already seen so far, it's just hard to reconcile with, like, okay, either there's something weird going on here that should cause suspicion, or we were on to something fundamental in terms of understanding the commonalities across these disorders that we normally don't appreciate. So what are the common mechanisms? And I put it this way. I think all of these disorders are associated with a narrowing of behavioral and mental repertoire. And I really think of it as addiction broadly defined. Whether you're talking about addiction to ingesting a substance repeatedly, or addiction to thinking about yourself in a certain way, as in depression. People are stuck in a very tight rut, a very deep well. And when you're in it, it's very difficult to pull yourself out of it. You need to be blasted out. And so I haven't been able to spend time on this, but some of the recent research, including some we've replicated at Hopkins recently, suggests that acutely there's some very interesting things in terms of changing brain network dynamics, the way that brain areas are communicating with each other. And one of the things we're looking at in the smoking study is, are there changes long-term in brain network dynamics, the way that the brain is communicating with itself? And so it's tempting to speculate that this is sort of like shuffled the board, that there's an ability, there's a plasticity in the system, and such that there can be a resettling of brain network dynamics into a more optimal state. And that might be sort of one of the biological correlates of this, of the more behavioral plasticity we're seeing with susceptibility to behavior change across a number of disorders. And then I think even beyond treatments, where like this all raises questions about what the world is going on here. We don't even know really what the role of these serotonin 2A receptors that mediate the psychedelic response are. Why are they more expressed in mammals than other animals? Why are they more expressed in the human than in other mammals? We know that they're major computational units in the brain. And so I think there may be a role in really modulating behavioral plasticity or large-scale meaning in life. A whole lot to figure out there. And kind of one way to summarize that is the dope slap effect. It's that I didn't recall telling this to him exactly in these terms, but he gave me a glass or two of wine over dinner, and we had a really great chat, a few chats actually, but Michael Pollan credited me with that. This name in the book, he said, Johnson believes the psychedelics can be used to change all sorts of behavior, not just addiction. The key in his view is their power to occasion a scientifically dramatic, sufficiently dramatic experience to dope slap people out of their story. psychedelics open a window of mental flexibility in which people can let go of the mental models we use to organize reality. And if that's the framework, this would suggest that it could be brought to bear on a whole lot of behavior, probably not all, but a whole lot of therapeutic behavior change. And it also helps to explain why, you don't necessarily always see the benefit, and sometimes you see some dramatic downside when the context isn't right. If you put something into a plastic state, a piece of pottery, now it's malleable. Well, you put it in the hands of a horrible artist, and you're not going to come up with something that's beautiful. So it's very contextually dependent. So this model fits with that type of thinking. And I'll briefly go through some recommendations. This field is like blowing up, and I think it's a great thing. But it's going to bring on some challenges. I think we need some wisdom. I mean, we need to avoid ideological answers to complex issues like, is it heresy to see if we can come up with analogs that don't have the psychedelic effect? Let's study it all. There's some people that will never qualify for a psychedelic experience for safety reasons. We need to, and there's there are people with very strong views against any commercial development of these compounds. And then there are people that think that, the medicalization, that thinking that there's any medical promise to these compounds at all is completely ridiculous from a traditional psychiatric perspective. I think we'd be best to avoid all of these extremes, and really kind of evaluate efforts by their own merits. By individual actors. It's a new mainstream field of medicine. Psychedelics occasion a human experience, and I think it's something we have to keep in mind. It's not just for subgroups. It's not just for hippies. It's not just for new agey folks. And I think we have to be careful as a field how we sell this stuff. I've seen too many grandmas benefit dramatically from this. For example, with cancer and trying to quit smoking, who would never take an illicit drug. And they'd be the last person you'd suspect would take psychedelics. I've seen, you name it, the person that you think would never be into psychedelics, the former military, political conservatives, you name it. I've seen experiences where people have had dramatic positive transformations in their life that, don't fit the model. And so we need to not sell it, by that model. This isn't, necessarily a new agey therapy. This isn't just for people that are into, hippie culture or into, whatever, hot yoga and all that. And all that stuff is fine. It's for those people too, potentially, but we just need to, we need to frame, this is about a human experience. And a lot of this is about sort of the framing of religious, even talking about spiritual experiences. I mean, we define the mystical experience as it's a known construct, but there are people that identify as religious. There are people who identify as spiritual, but not religious. And then there are people that say all of those words sound like a bunch of baloney, and they're not into any of that. And I'm telling you what, there are plenty of people in that last category who don't even want to use the word spiritual, who can potentially benefit from this. And because, for them, spiritual means crystals and chakras and all of that. It doesn't, sometimes someone comes out of a session thinking, saying they felt profoundly connected to everybody they know in their life, and they feel part of the human family, and they see human existence from a broader perspective. And you say, well, is that spiritual? And they say, well, no, I didn't see any angels or anything, and you ask this, another person has a similar experience, whether it's spiritual, and they say, well, are you not listening to me? And so just these words mean very different things. Ultimately, I think it's best to focus on these are human. This is about meaning in human beings. And then kind of with that in mind, I think, we need to have an appropriate therapeutic orientation, at least within mainstream medicine using these compounds. These need to be framed from an empirical basis as secular clinicians. We need to keep in mind that we are not priests or shaman. Those people do what they do, and we can learn from, as I've written, from indigenous cultural use of these things, but we need to do what makes sense in our culture by our own standards. And we need to, there's kind of it's been called a cultogenic effect of these compounds. We need to check ourselves in terms of, playing the priest or shaman and letting it go to our heads. It's hard to be associated with one of the most meaningful experiences that a patient might have when you're guiding them through that experience. We need to be open to all orientation, any religion, lack thereof, atheists, not pushing any of them. We need to hold to a strong empirical framework, just like a good psychologist or psychiatrist would. Whatever the participant brings to the table, if they're religious, if they bring Buddha to the table, if they bring Jesus to the table, fine, you can talk that. It's not your job to be introducing these things to people, and it's going to be really in this relates to the use of religious icons, which I don't in the studies that I supervise. I think participants are welcome to bring all of their own meaningful objects, which can include religious icons or anything else that they want in their sessions. And I think professional boundaries and ethics are going to be very important as this field grows. The potential for sexual abuse, the potential for people, even if they don't go the full Tim Leary route, you can kind of go, partially there in terms of, kind of letting it get to your head, being associated with these profound experiences that you're helping to engender in people. So instead of falling into the trap of psychedelic exceptionalism and thinking, oh, these are different, this is bigger than all of that, the old rules don't apply, it's more reason to adhere to and honor the old rules, the good old wisdom that has gone into those professional ethics in medicine, in clinical psychology, etc. And I guess that's about it. I want to thank far more people than I could even have time to thank. A huge number of collaborators at Hopkins. If you want to see more about our research and as it continues to go, check us out at hopkinspsychedelic.org. You can follow me on Twitter at drug_researcher, where I usually post some of our research. And thank you very much.
Wow, I think this is where the applause comes. So that was fantastic. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's get into the questions as soon as possible. I think one of the questions is, from your experience, who are the main opponents of decriminalization or legalization of psychedelics? Is there an active group working against the advancement of this research?
Well, I guess first it kind of depends on what you mean. I mean, are we talking about the medical development, or are we talking about decriminalization efforts? In terms of the medical, which in fact is one form of legalization, it makes it legal, under certain medical guidelines. The astonishing thing is that there aren't really any credible formal opponents. There's very few people, really none that are credible, that are out there saying this, they've looked at the data, this research shouldn't be happening, there's nothing here, this is extremely dangerous. Now, there are a few people saying those things, but they're not the highly respected people in addiction
that
science.
Was the easy one. That was the easy one.
Okay,
what about the recreational? What about the decrim? No, because this is something we have to, whether we are in favor or against, I think yes and is our approach. But I think there are people actively working to stop the decriminalization and the, reducing access to botanicals in Oregon, for example.
Yeah, with this, I think, I'm not sure who that's a good question. And I think the most direct answer is I'm not sure who's most actively opposing those efforts. My personal stance on it is that, I kind of invite people to support what they feel is the right thing to do. And and kind of work on your own thing. And if you're not into a particular initiative, there's no need to, trash talk it, but you don't necessarily need to be an advocate for it. I mean, my personal views on decriminalization, I think that the science has been there for a long time, and the human rights has been there from the very beginning, like treating addiction and the very real. I've spent like my entire career, like 20 plus years studying addiction, and I've studied them all, like methamphetamine, smoking, alcohol, cocaine, I get it. Like, these are very, life-threatening problems that people develop with these compounds. The idea that a criminal justice approach is the best way to deal with this it doesn't make any sense. The data are not there. It actually defies everything we know about good behavior analysis in terms of decreasing problematic behavior. And there's huge, human rights issues. I mean, you just mentioned the racial differences in the enforcement of these laws and incarceration. So I think I'm on very safe ground, and both science, politically, scientifically, saying like drug decriminalization is a very good thing. That's not to encourage people to use any drugs, but the idea that locking people up, taking away their education, their ability to have a good job, taking parents away from kids.
You're definitely preaching to the converted, if I can use that phrase. I think our community is behind you. Now, another question was asked, and I think it's a legitimate one. Where do you source your psilocybin? I think people in our community are looking for trusted sources for research grade material for GMP, for example. I know we've discussed it. How can we help the community?
So most of our research has been conducted with a supply that was created by Dave Nichols, probably the chemist who makes the purest psychedelics on the planet. But while he was active at Purdue University, he's retired from there now. But David Nichols, our colleague, created the supply that most of our research has used. He is no longer creating that. He's no longer there. We're one of the our site, our group is one of the sites of the USONA multi-site major depression trials that USONA is running, and we're using their product there and for some of our other research. So we don't have any role. It's going to depend on the studies the new studies that pop up.
Let's put USONA's link either in the notes here, or we'll add it to the Hoover chat, because they're doing incredible work, and I think they're definitely partners for all research with psilocybin and also some other molecules. Okay, another question, also bringing research and academia together with industry. If people here want to collaborate with Johns Hopkins and help you guys and work with you guys and take some of that research the next step, what do you recommend they do?
Well, if there's something credible, reach out to myself and or the other faculty at Hopkins. I mean, unfortunately, there are far more people that want to help than are able to help. So, I mean, someone has to, if we're talking about industry, I mean, is there a study they want to have, they want to fund to be run, for example? I mean, just, kind of, yeah. Yeah, I mean, good ideas are, and just the support is, or the moral support is something we appreciate, but
But you guys can provide services. You guys can provide clinical services. If an organization wants to do a clinical trial involving some psychedelic substances, they can contact you and possibly do the study with you and your team. Is that?
Yeah, so I would love to eventually be doing research with novel compounds and formulations. I mean, I think there's just on the scientific side alone, there's a huge potential here to learn about. I mean, all of the science has been with just a few compounds so far in psychedelic science, and there are literally hundreds out there and more to be discovered, and different formulations and routes of existing compounds to be explored. And so this work is going to be necessary for the therapeutic development, but it's also just to be a nerd. It's just really scientifically fascinating work.
And on that, let's talk about the psychedelics that are not psychedelic. So we're discussing the microdosing in a previous discussion, and also some of these serotonin agonists that don't produce that psychedelic effect. Do we have a branding problem? Is there a language problem, or how do you see the community moving forward with that on what is a true psychedelic?
I'm not sure there's an easy answer to that. For some people, saying this is a non-psychoactive version of a psychedelic is helps to increase interest and credibility. And for other audiences, maybe it decreases it, so maybe you kind of choose your branding depending on your audience. If the man wants a blue suit, turn on a blue light. Have your different drug brochures ready for the right target audience.
Warning,
But I
don't
think,
take marketing advice from a researcher, but fair enough.
oh yeah, I agree. Don't listen to
Uh,
me.
I do want to bring, you mentioned in the slide, and I know you're possibly not doing the research, but anorexia as maybe a research area that doesn't get enough attention. Is there anything you can talk about? Maybe some people in the community would like to take this further into the product space.
So in terms of, are there researchers that
are currently working on it? I saw on the slide there was anorexia as part of the research group's indications.
So
where are we at on that?
Yeah. So someone, a young researcher that's actually taking the lead on that work is Natalie Gusakian, who's a psychiatrist, who's kind of new at the research game and part of our group at Hopkins. And certainly, there are a number of other individuals. I have to say, Albert Garcia Romeo, who's been the primary guide on most of the smoking cessation work at this time. He's going to be leading, he already is leading the work that's treating depression within Alzheimer's patients. And Al has a lot of great ideas and different threads that he's following with psychedelic research. Fred Barrett, who's a phenomenal neuroscientist, particularly with fMRI techniques, who's a part of our group, is another person I'd mention. So yeah.
All right. Another question came in about the work in the religious setting of giving people. Yeah, you know the question. So could you dive a little bit more about that research?
Yeah. So we've had sort of a small study of religious professionals, basically with some broad questions of, people have these, what many people describe as spiritual or sometimes religious experiences. What happens if you give it to people that are do this for a living? They engage in religious activity for a living. So many questions there, like do they also have similar experiences? I think the most interesting questions there, and I should say that this is just now finishing. We don't have answers yet, so you have to wait for the formal publications. I will say that people have had some powerful experiences, very meaningful experiences. And the thing I'm most interested to see, and including in looking at our own data, are what effects on the ground. Are people kind of less burnt out? Are people kind of re-engaged with what got them into whatever? And we're getting people from as many religions as we can, very diverse. Whatever led them to be a religious professional. Are they more willing to sit with the widow, to be there at 3 a.m. when a member of their congregation is in the hospital, that type of thing, and be just burdened by everyone's problems, and like they don't have their own problems. So I could imagine, in a way, like mental health professionals, like these have to be real issues. I'd love to see if there's any movement on those outcomes.
Wow, so poignant for today in particular. So I think that's going to be the last question. I really do appreciate your time. You've done tireless work spreading the gospel, if you will, to people in our community. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your research and all those years of hard work. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Johnny. Thanks, everybody.